Welcome to the first edition of Resistance TV after the summer break. This evening we're going to be speaking about the housing crisis and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic that has caused so many problems for many people, particularly private renters. And we know that from some of the figures released recently that nearly 250,000 people are potentially facing eviction. We've got three guests with us this evening to discuss where we are with housing at the moment and what solutions ought to be being adopted by the government in relation to the housing crisis that is befallen the country. The first guest is a woman called Tanya Murat. She is the chair of Southwark Defend Council Housing, and she helped to lead the successful campaign against council house stock transfer and is involved in trying to prevent the eviction of 40 independent traders from the Elephant and Castle shopping centre. She's also leading the campaign to requisition empty homes in the London Borough of Southwark. The second guest this evening is Tess Delaney. She's a writer and a tree grower. She lost her house after losing her business. The local council won't let her live on her own land in Pembrokeshire, where housing's scarce and where there's a massive amount of second homes and low employment. And then the final guest is Ray Woolford. He's an activist, an author, a broadcaster, and a lifetime LGBTQ community and housing activist. He's also the CEO of the Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Network and the founder of We Care, which is the largest independent food bank in the UK. I wonder if we could perhaps start with you, Tanya, in relation to council housing, because there's been an ongoing problem with the reduction in the amount of council houses over the last 40 years or so. And the Defend Council Housing campaign was fighting a rearguard action for most of that time to try and stop the selling off of council houses, not just through right to buy, but also through something called large-scale voluntary transfer. And many local authorities transferred their housing stock, lock, stock and barrel, to housing associations, and that's left us with a huge problem in terms of people needing housing now. Many people forced into private renting, which is generally a lot more expensive than council housing. And so, in my experience, many people are trapped, even people on relatively decent incomes, trapped in expensive private accommodation, private rented accommodation, unable to find a council house because there are so few and far between, and unable to save up a deposit for their own property because the rent is so high. And this is a particular problem in London and parts of the south, and there are other as it were black spots up and down the country where private rented housing is particularly expensive. So I just wondered perhaps if what your thoughts are, Tanya, if you could just start maybe talking about that, and particularly in relation to how the COVID situation is affecting people in terms of, as I've already said, many people are now facing potential evictions and from private rented accommodation, and the lack of council housing that people can potentially move into if they were slapped with an eviction notice because they've lost their job, or they're unable to pay the rent because the furlough salary is inadequate to meet their outgoings. What's your thoughts, Tanya?
Yes, well, thanks for having me on, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really been a huge loss of council housing. So since the 1980s, there's been 1.5 million homes lost. Council homes lost to the right to buy. There's wide-scale demolitions, particularly in London, but also elsewhere. There's Regeneration, which ends up being the social cleansing of working class people from their homes and the areas that they've grown up in, lived in all their lives. And there's a massive building programme, particularly in places like Southwark, of very unaffordable, very expensive luxury investment homes. And I think there's a failure of political leadership, really, because council housing was a pillar of the welfare state, and it enabled people to continue to survive if they perhaps lost their jobs or got ill. It absolutely was about building communities. And we've lost a lot of that. And what it's been replaced with is really a very kind of soulless landscape. And I just want to say that none of this was inevitable. You know, Tony Blair came down to the Aylesbury estate back in 97. It was the first estate that he visited, and said, this is terrible, it's a sink estate, and we're going to make that estate much better by redeveloping it. Regeneration will transform things for the people that live here. And what actually has been done is that large numbers of people have been removed from the area, but that there's been a struggle, there's been a fight. And leaseholders have fought over their right to stay, and the compulsory purchase orders forced a change in the council's policy towards leaseholders. And actually, the developer, Notting Hill Housing, or Notting Hill Genesis, as it's called now, is only still on phase 1 of the development. But you have an extraordinary situation there. So Notting Hill Housing, for whatever reason, don't seem to be able to develop the estate fully. There's still plenty of people living on it. And they're on phase 1, but their development model seems to have fallen down, and they won't be selling most of those flats in phase 1. There'll be more than 500 new council homes in phase 1, but the council's actually bailing out the developer to the tune of £590,000 for each additional council home, or for each additional social rented home that they put on the estate. So what you have is a developer in trouble, a housing association so-called, and a council going in and bailing out that developer. And really, it's a political bankruptcy.
We seem to have got local authorities, governments of every stripe, frankly, New Labour and the Conservatives, got the priorities all the wrong way round. I mean, obviously, we know Thatcher's government brought in the right to buy. Incidentally, that was a pinch from a Labour policy in 1959. I don't know if you probably know this. I mean, Labour in the 1959 general election manifesto pledged to introduce a right to buy. I suspect had Labour introduced it, it would have probably been a bit more sustainable than the model that the Tories adopted. But anyway, it was subsequently dropped. So what we've seen is obviously council houses being sold off. The capital receipts weren't returned to the local authorities. They were being sold off at a fraction of their value. We've seen, as I mentioned in the outset there, the properties being wholesale estates, the entire housing stock in local authorities being transferred to local authorities. And, we're spending so much money now, public money, on housing benefit in the private rented sector, 23 plus 24 billion pounds a year. And now that, interestingly, the Tories have lifted the cap, the borrowing cap on the housing revenue account, something that many of us who've been campaigning on housing have been calling for many, many years. There doesn't seem to be too much of an impediment now on local authorities to actually start building council houses at volume in the way in which Nye Bevan brought about in that post-war Labour government in 1945. What's your thoughts on that, Tanya, in terms of local authorities stepping up to the plate now that the cap has been lifted on the housing revenue account? I mean, shouldn't they be doing more to build? I mean, the government, a Tory government, ironically, has given them the tools to do it, haven't they?
It is easier. There's no doubt about it. Now the borrowing cap's been lifted, there are still impediments.
Can you just set out what those impediments are then, Tanya?
Well, I'm not an expert on housing, council housing finance, although we might have someone on the call that could answer that question, Glyn. However, what I would say is that the council where I live in Southwark, they have talked about building 11,000 council homes over the next few years. But the real problem is the number of homes that they're demolishing. And actually, I would bring sustainability into this as well, and also the huge number of empty homes in the private sector. And before we start to think about building at mass scale, even though of course that is important, we also need to think about the number of homes that are empty and that the council should be able to requisition. And so we've been looking at a number of those developments in our area. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of where we are now with the COVID crisis and the fact that, you know, people are potentially likely in huge numbers to lose their employment, many of them will be in the private renters sector, and you know, it's unlikely that the landlords are going to be able to allow people to continue to live in the properties if they can't pay the rent, because obviously landlords are there to you know, make a profit, as it were. Should we be putting pressure on local authorities to step up to the plate to address this huge crisis that there is? I mean, obviously you've mentioned that, you know, the empty homes, they could be taking action on, they could be taking action to build more, but of course that's, you know, a medium-term solution, given that we've got this COVID crisis and it's likely, potentially anyway, to be upon us before the end of the year, a huge upsurge in evictions. And this is going to be horrendous, isn't it? I mean, unless the local authorities and the government step up to the plate and do something, I mean, you know, I don't know what are people going to be on the street, and or are they going to end up in, you know, in unsuitable bed and breakfast, which is very expensive as well? I mean, the whole thing just seems a complete nonsense, doesn't it, really? But anyway, what's your thought?
Well, I think that what we need to think about is why homes exist. Yes. and get back to first principles, really. Yeah. There are thousands and thousands of empty homes. Particularly in the capital. Just to give you an idea, there's more than 2,000 officially empty homes in our borough. Some of those are council homes where people have been decanted awaiting demolition, but quite a large number of private properties. That's officially empty. That's where the landlord decides to register them as empty. There are thousands more that are empty and not on the radar. And really, I think we should look back in history to see where it has happened before that working class people have forced a change in government policy. Now, after the Second World War, actually the last act of Churchill's government wasn't his most publicised act. It was to make the requisitioning of empty homes easier. There was a massive crisis, housing crisis. So many homes had been destroyed in the war. Veterans were coming back, homeless, families living on the streets. There was a huge squatter movement. And people went and took over both the old army bases and empty homes in central London, empty apartment blocks, and so on. And in order to head that movement off, the government was forced to allow councils to requisition those empty homes. Now, I think that we're in a situation where we have a massive health crisis and a massive housing crisis. And actually, it's a crisis of people who are from BAME communities as well. 80% of people in Southwark who are registered homeless are from BAME communities. And there are thousands and thousands of homes lying empty or Airbnb. Now, the councils should be forcing the government to allow them to quickly requisition homes. Now, there is legislation, they can do it at the moment, but it's not the easiest thing to do, and it's not the quickest thing to do. So again, we need the political will and the political leadership to enable that to happen. And Labour councils everywhere should be fighting for that right, and they should be encouraging people to take over empty homes.
So in terms of, obviously this is Resistance TV, and as you know, Tanya, we're trying to build a new grassroots movement. We've been slightly hampered, of course, by the pandemic, but we are setting up local chapters now. I mean, I think, would your advice be that we should be pressurising local authorities to use the powers that they have at the moment, as well as pressing government to, push through some? I think we need emergency legislation really to make compulsory purchase, to acquire the properties in the way in which you sort of outlined as was done after the Second World War. You mentioned there, of course, about the squatter movement at that time. It's a bit more difficult now, isn't it, squatting, because they've criminalised it, haven't they? I think it was Thatcher's government, wasn't it? So, in terms of us taking, the public, as it were, taking direct action, the potential consequences are more severe, more punitive than they were back in those days. But clearly there is a massive crisis, and we do need to be stepping up to the plate and putting political pressure, I think, as you say. But maybe there's a case for direct action as well, because certainly if there are going to be, if we end up with the mass evictions, I think direct action is potentially going to be needed to hopefully force the hand of government and local authorities to do more. But let me just bring in Ray now. Thanks, Tanya. We'll come back obviously to you. Ray, you're a community activist, and I just wondered what your thoughts are in relation to where we are in terms of the crisis, and what scope there is for political community direct action in that sense to force the hand of the politicians, and what other steps, if any, do you think are potentially available given the lackluster response that we've had from both ministers and from local authorities?
I couldn't agree with you, but there is a simple process. I'm talking as a gay man that spent life on the streets of London, so I know what it's like to be homeless, and I've been a council tenant up for 38 years. I then set up a social enterprise housing company, which then housed people in crisis. Now I live in my own house outside council, so I just wanted to make that clear. But there's a number of things that should be done immediately. There's no point in building new council housing if you don't alter the right to buy. If you buy a new flat these days, there would be restrictions in the lease that says no wood floors, no cats, no dogs. Why is it with council housing, when it was sold off, did they not have a clause that said if you want to rent this house because you're working abroad or whatever, or a partner in another part of the UK, and you're temporarily away from your housing, that you must rent that house back to the local authority? The same with if you want to sell your house, you should have to sell your house at the council buyback value. And what's happened, of course, is the Tories thought nobody would want to live on the council estate. They didn't realise on council estates, that's where people had communities. When I was growing up on the council estate, everybody was your aunt, everybody was your uncle. When we had the miners' strike, when we had the poll tax, we were all united, we all fought and went together. Today, what's happened with the tenants movement is the tenants movement has been sidestepped in such a way. But when people go to the tenants meeting, the council promise they're going to do this, they're going to do that. They never do, so people don't go. Go to these public consultations on new developments, as they did with Convoy Wharf, where local residents are mobilising on the GoFundMe page to challenge the government on what's happening with Convoy Wharf in London, another housing scandal that's going on here. And what's really happening is that nobody seems to realise that the economic benefits of council housing, if we build council housing and protect it, it means that the posh people in the house can get their cleaners and get their nannies, they can get their school teachers, they can get their fitness instructors. It's in their economic interest to do that. And for councils, we consistently fighting austerity. After COVID, we've got terrible things coming down the line. And what we should be thinking is protect council housing so councils have rents that they can use to pay for frontline services. So they don't have to sell off our land. Remember, the land that councils are giving away to these developers for no real community benefit is our land. We elect councillors to defend it for ours. And I also think that we need to do more and go forward like empty shops. Why do we have empty shops when they could be homes? All these empty buildings could be temporary, given to homeless units in the local council, and then passed down to grassroots to address the housing route. And then finally, I just want to add in Airbnb. There's 48,000 Airbnb rooms in London. That many of those aren't even licensed. It seems scandalous that you invite or children, a strange person into your home to rent a room without any security. When back in the day when we were younger, we all had a lodger. And a lodger is something that, there's lots of single people, lots of people that need the support of living in a family or just, a comrade type of environment, commune type of housing. It's another thing that we should be looking at. And I find it really scandalous that housing does not look into what's needed. It doesn't take into account people's disability. It doesn't take into account people's diversity. It doesn't take into account people's mental health. And it doesn't take into account the economic benefits of having housing, council estates, the people that live on the council estates, and the way that those people contribute to the wider societies, whether they clean your streets, the doctors in your nurses in your care homes. They are really, really important aspects of our national psyche, and we should treasure our council housing in the same way we do our NHS. And unfortunately, the political classes see council housing as not inspirational enough. It's not something that inspires people. And they don't seem to understand that we don't live our lives because we're driven by money. We live our lives because we want to have a decent life. We want to have a neighborhood that we feel proud and neighbors that we can say hello to. We want our kids to grow up safe without knife crime and have the chance of a job. And whatever that is, there's no stigma. There should be no stigma whether you're a road sweeper or care worker to somebody that goes to university. They all contribute to our well-being. And COVID and what's happening now at the moment with all the evictions is scandalous because community centres, advice centres and access to law is not in place. And many people facing evictions, which is coming down the line. And during this COVID crisis, we occupied a supermarket in Sydenham in southeast London. And we filled it with mainly homeless women that were not housed by all these government schemes that promised to house all these people. And then at 5 o'clock in the morning, even though it was illegal to evict, a whole load of lorry load of men arrived at 5 a.m. in the morning, evicted all these women, and they couldn't get any access to legal representation at that time or during COVID, even to this day. And the police did not want to know. And so people, when they're in housing need and when they're occupying an empty building, which they're not claiming housing benefit, it's in all our interest. When people are occupying an empty building, they're spending in the local shops. Quite often they're plant growing, they're contributing in all sorts of positive ways into the community. And I think we need to go back to valuing the importance of council housing, the role they play that benefits us all, and their importance as a revenue stream for local authorities.
I mean, I think many people have clung to that notion all the way through this period of diminution in council housing. Unfortunately, the powers that be in both the major political parties seem wedded to this notion of right to buy, and that clearly does need legislative change. I mean, where I think local authorities have more scope to be flexible and to be, positively, making a difference, is in rather than selling off these whole chunks of land and estates, which seem to be happening, particularly in London, they should be building council houses as well as requisitioning. But what would you? I mean, you were sort of touched on there a little bit, Ray, about some of the actions that people can take. Obviously, there's potential consequences now, more serious consequences for squatting. What practical actions do you think that people can take to actually bring pressure and actually do something to positive, out with the politicians actually not stepping up to the plate?
Yeah, I want to give you two really good examples where activism works. Okay. I live in the borough of Lewisham. I was active for a while. I'm not in any political movement now. I'm just a community activist. I was heavily involved with the housing group People Before Profit. And one day we found that the local council, Lewisham, was selling decent Victorian houses for next to nothing at auction in London. And so what we did, we went to all the viewing days and we occupied all the empty houses and hid in the cellars and hid in cupboards. And when the auction people went away, we occupied those houses. And then what we did, we got community plumbers to clean them and connect the electrics and the plumbing. And we filled all these houses with families that were on Lewisham Council's own housing waiting list. And therefore, we highlighted the fact that if you have a housing lead, councils should not be selling off council houses. As a direct consequence of that one action, Lewisham Council stopped the selling of all private housing. So that's the old Victorian houses, you know, the blocks of flat, anything that they felt was slightly difficult or needed a bit of work, they were trying to get rid of. Now they use Lewisham College to use apprenticeships to refurbish those houses for local needs. So that was a direct action. The other thing we did, we had a big scandal in New Cross in Besson Street where we had thousands of council tenants living on a council estate, and the council bulldozed the council estate for development. It's still empty to this day. And so what we did was we occupied the site and we built a green eco house in a week to highlight that we as activists could build a green house that was habitable in a week. And the council had had this land empty for years. They bulldozed us the next day and got a writ to get us off the site. And we then built the house for a week outside the Lewisham Town Hall in Lewisham. So I think that there is ways that we can take direct action. But in the world that we live today, you have to do things that are very media savvy. So things that will get the clicks, will get the likes, that get the attention. Because our politicians today go by media headlines. They don't go by their electorate. They're long ago been abandoned. Local democracy, it's all about developers' gold. That's what they want, not community votes. And so we need to be taking direct action, not be fearful of it. Of course, what you've missed earlier on is that the Tories also changed the law, which means that if you have a criminal conviction for some types of direct action, you can now lose your council house. And it's not just you that will lose your council house, but your family could lose their council house. And then the other point I just want to highlight is we keep hearing about the numbers on the waiting list, and people forget that the government changed the laws about access to waiting lists. And so tens of thousands of people that were eligible for council housing were automatically removed from the list. And that completely distorts the reality of the real housing need that we have in the UK. And it just varies. Like in Durham, you can get whole streets where the houses are empty. But we need to do something about balancing up the whole UK. I do support that idea. But we also need to do something about making sure that if you're moving people from London to Watford to Leicester, then that's addressed. Because at the moment in London, if you earn £16,000, you can't get universal credit. Now, 16,000 sounds a lot of money, but the average one-bedroom flat in London is £15,000 a year. Once you add in the council tax, that's another 1,000 plus. That's more than 16,000. So where are people going to eat? Which is why my food bank is the biggest independent food bank in the UK, because people pay their rent and then they can't eat. And that is another scandal. In the fifth, sixth richest economy in the country, we are seeing people found in the news media starving to death in Britain in 2020 during COVID. And that is totally unacceptable. And there's so much that should be done. And it's an issue about economics. And if you can win the economic argument with the Tories, I think that's where we have to go. I think they just brush us off as left-wing activists. But if you explain the economics, the advantages of the rent that comes from council housing and the advantages that council tenants contribute,
they're enormous, aren't they?
Yes,
absolutely. And I mean, absolutely enormous. And I mean, to me, it just it's a no-brainer. It's a common sense, really. Surely, I mean, you can provide housing at a lower cost. You reduce the burden on the public purse because you reduce the social security costs associated with housing, because rents in councils are lower. You tackle a social need and create lots of jobs. I mean, the jobs are good, and why aren't they doing it? I mean, but I think more of us need to be making that making that case. Ray, I mean, some great ideas that you've just outlined there. Look, we send a newsletter out to our supporters on a regular basis, and we've also got a newspaper which is in the offing now called The Word, which is online at the moment. It's going to be printed. I just wonder whether, some of those ideas that you've just outlined there, if you wouldn't mind just jotting a few hundred words down for us, and we'll circulate that, because some fantastic ideas there, which I think could be replicated in other parts of the country. And I think one of the things that we want to do with this movement that we're trying to create here is network and give people ideas and give people that collective strength that when we stand together in solidarity, look, you're not on your own. There's fantastic campaigns happening in different parts of the country. And that could inspire, I think, other people. I mean, hopefully people watching, what you've just said will inspire. But if you'd be up for just, knocking something together for us, we'll circulate around to our supporters and hopefully get some action going in other parts of the country.
I'd love to. The other thing, just quickly, is that I'm also I'm a lifetime poverty campaigner as well, and I've got a Parliament petition at the moment calling for a minister for poverty, because I think we're at such a stage now with housing, education, health, jobs. We need a minister for poverty. Many would argue that Tories are responsible for poverty. I agree, but we should shame all political parties into realising that a minister for poverty that oversees its eradication has to be a priority by all political parties, not just the government. And a parliamentary petition is the only one the government has a legal obligation to respond to.
Yeah.
Change, they see it's political, they ignore it. But Parliament petition, which is why I've done it, it shames them if nothing else. And if people could Parliament petition and sign it, and Minister for Poverty, we may not win it, but you've got to keep hitting it. You've got to.
I think you're right. We do need to keep hitting it. I mean, frankly, I think the political class is broken, and we need to be encouraging and inspiring new leaders to come through, and we perhaps need a new electoral vehicle as well. I say that as someone who was in the Labour Party for 44 years, and I just feel very let down. I mean, obviously we had the Jeremy Corbyn project, and that was hopeful. I mean, a Jeremy talk, for example, about eradicating street homelessness. I think we could have gone further. I mean, we should have been saying, as you've just outlined there, a government in the 5th biggest economy in the world should have a clear commitment to eradicate poverty in its entirety in the lifetime of a parliament. And that's possible. It's all about political will in the end. And it's not there at the moment. We need to force that political will through collective action, direct action, and the positivity of community campaigns like you've been outlining there very effectively, Ray. That's really inspiring. Thank you for that. Let me just move on to Tess, if I may, because one of the points that Ray just made there, Tess, was about building an eco house. And you're someone, as I think I mentioned in the introduction, or certainly in the blurb that went out advertising tonight's program. You built an eco house, didn't you? And the local authority in Pembrokeshire there has forced you to demolish it. I wonder if you could perhaps just tell us your story, because that just seems incredible at a time when there's a climate catastrophe potentially on the horizon. We have a housing crisis that we've mentioned as well, and in your area in particular, there's major problems with affordable housing and second homes and precarious employment, etc. It's a major problem. You seem to have been, to me anyway, been pressing all the right buttons. Ecologically sound, self-sufficiency, and so on. And yet, the powers that be in your local area, the bureaucracy, has forced you out. I mean, just tell your story, Tess, because it's absolutely shocking.
It's quite fun, isn't it? It's the council, while my planning application was in, I put in a planning application for my house. It was just a little temporary house, which is now a workshop. I wanted to build a bigger one. But I was refused twice. I was refused my planning application twice, and then I was refused at appeal. But during the 18 months that this was all going on, Pembrokeshire County Council declared a climate emergency, spurned on by one of the councillors, Joshua Bainan. And that's what they said, climate emergency, we need to sort this out. And then they proceeded to refuse my planning application. So I have owned houses. I used to be a teacher, and I was a lecturer at the University of Wales. I owned a couple of houses. I owned a house in Narberth. I was a single parent for 16 years, and I held it together for all that time. And I got to a point where I had a shop, a music shop. I lost that. And things just fell apart, got divorced, lost my house. So I thought, well, this OPD, One Planet Development thing in Wales scheme, where you can build an eco house on your own land, so long as you can prove that you can do certain things, like you sustain yourself with growing your own food. You have to provide 65% of all your needs. That's electricity, water. I've got a spring here on my land. I'm on solar panels. The reason I'm outside now is because I'm having a nightmare with my internet because I rely on 4G. So if I'm coming across as a little robot, apologies. Ironically, the house I owned was an ex-council house in Narberth, ex-local authority, and I remember in the 80s, my granddad refusing to buy his council house in Wiltshire when it first became a thing. And that was my first introduction to socialism. That's what made me a socialist, was everyone talking about my granddad not buying his council house when he had the chance. He could have bought it for nothing. And he refused. He said, no, social houses are for people. And he moved from council house to council house to council house for the rest of his life, smaller and smaller housing, until he got into kind of sheltered housing and then a little bungalow by my mum. And so ironically, when I ended up like buying a house, it was the second house I'd bought, but it was an ex-council house, which just to me was really ironic, but it was the only one I could afford, because they do have a cap on them for a price. So, and it was a nice house. So when I lost that, I thought, well, I can take advantage of this OPD scheme in Wales. I've always been interested in growing. I grow trees. And
remind us what OPD stands for.
It's One Planet Development. It's a scheme that was brought in by Jane Davidson. She was the Environmental Minister for Wales, and it was brought in 10 years ago. Since then, 34 applicants have been successful in 10 years. So it's not easy. You have to, the application I put in was like 100 pages long, and you have to prove every aspect of every single tiny thing you're going to do. You have to add value to everything on your land. So for instance, if you're growing timber, it's not enough to grow timber. You've got to sell timber for some reason. You've got to add value to it. You've got to carve it into something, or you've got to turn it into firewood. Or if you're growing, you have to prove that you can make a certain amount of money each year. And what becomes evident from this is that OPD, though I thought it may be a sort of little social housing answer with the added bonus of ecology, because to me, OPD, they say you build an eco house. To me, all new housing should be eco housing. I don't get why it's not. It should be. And that's not necessarily, I'm not saying everything should be made of straw. My place is made out of recycled materials, my little cabin there, and tree surgery waste. As trees that are going to be cut down anyway, we milled them on site into planks, and we clad everything. And there's some tin on there that I picked up from an old hay shed in Robertson Wathen a few years ago. So it's all just recycled stuff, which to me is what OPD is about. But of course, people get upset when they see recycled things because they want everything to look neat and tidy. And what OPD has turned into now is lots of neat places that look wonderful, and they have to do monitoring reports every year, and it's getting a lot for some people. And now people are starting to sell, and they're selling for a lot of money, obviously, because they're these lovely eco houses, some of which are featured on Grand Designs and stuff like that. And on these wonderful plots that people have worked on for 10 years. And now they're getting criticized for selling for lots of money. However, what you're supposed to do in a capitalist society, I mean, if you've got this, you can't have your own, if everybody's not doing it, if everybody's not towing the line with social ways, you can't cut off your nose to spite your face, can you? Which is what a lot of people said my granddad did. But at the moment, in Pembrokeshire, they seem to be having a huge housing boom at the moment. We're selling, like, things that have been on the market for ages seem to be selling. There's a bit of land behind me it's like a bog, and it's been on the market for like 10 years or something. It's really wet, but suddenly there's millions of viewers, and everybody wants to come to Wales because land is cheap and properties at the moment are cheap.
Local working class community, I mean, how are they, young people from working class households in your neck of the woods? I mean, are they able to get on the property ladder, or so there's this housing boom, but who's benefiting from the housing boom? Presumably not local working class people.
No, there's not many people local buying properties. Anything for under 100 grand is going straight away. because it's the only thing that anyone around here could possibly afford on their wages. Ironically, I've been looking at the sort of mortgage situation. If you buy a flat in the dock for 40 grand, your mortgage payments would be £150 a month. However, to rent the same flat is £350 to £400 a month.
Yeah.
So landlords are buying them up. But I notice, laws with rentals are changing. I think there's been some insulation changes and building regs changes and rental and rules and regulations. So I think a lot of landlords are selling flats now. There's a lot coming up for sale. But anyone local can't really buy much of what comes up for sale around here. The wages just aren't enough, and there isn't enough. There just isn't enough high wages, really. The average wage is quite low. If you see a job advertised around here for 22 grand, you think, oh, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So
which, I mean, 22 grand is below the national average, of course. I mean, where are you now in terms of your situation? Are you at the end of the road? Is there any further appeals available to you now, or?
Well, there would be if I had a big pot of money and I could put some more coins in the machine, like Space Invaders. I could go to the High Court or Crown Court or whatever. But some friends of mine up in Ceredigion, they went to court, they won. They thought they had their planning and it was all tickety-boo. And then a couple of weeks later, the Ceredigion Council appealed the decision. So now they're back to the beginning. They've got to start all over again. So there's kind of really no point in me spending loads of money, even if I did have it, on fighting it. So my choice now.
It sounds to me then, I mean, obviously where we can use the legal system, then I think we should, but it's prohibitively expensive, which is problematic, obviously. I mean, there are things like crowdfunding campaigns that can be waged, but, in the end, I think it's going to be collective action, isn't it? And direct action and building an alternative political vehicle so we can get people elected who actually represent the best interests of local communities. It's shocking, really, isn't it? To me, anyway. I've been a political animal all my life, and I mean, maybe that's why I got into trouble, because I always felt that when you have a political platform, you should use it to kind of try and stand up for people in that sense. And unfortunately, there are not enough people are doing that. I mean, what would you suggest? I mean, do you think that's the way forward then, collective action, or what?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because my local councillor, Hugh George, he's an independent councillor, and he promised me faithfully during my application that he would help me, and he was also kind, and then he Judased me and he didn't help me at all. So in 2 years, when we do the local elections, I'm going to run against him, because why not? He's been there unopposed pretty much since 2008, and he was going to help. There's a couple down the road. They're in their 70s and 80s. They've lived in a static caravan since 1997. They've been there for years and years and years. The council have suddenly decided they've got to go, and they've been enforced, and the councillor was going to help them too, but he didn't. So now there's this really elderly couple from up the road. I saw them the other day. He was talking about that they're going to sleep in their car because they can only be on their land during daylight hours. They're not allowed to sleep there. And it's just, it's unfathomable. And like you say, with the climate crisis, with the housing crisis, I found it incredible that the Welsh Assembly, when I went to appeal, said no. I can house myself. I can give myself an income and a job. The council said to me, no, we don't believe you can make enough money to support yourself in your endeavour. But suddenly they seem to think I can make enough money from my little bit here to go and rent a house. How does that work? All the rents around here are way too expensive. Even the council rents around here are expensive, and there's no council houses. And like you were saying earlier on about the provision of council houses, what's stopping it? Acquisition of land. There's loads of land around here. There's a million of acres, and there are some houses being built in the village up the road. A lot of them are private, and I think there's 12 or 14 are going to be social housing. And everyone's a little bit up in arms, going, well, one guy said, well, we don't know who we're going to get. And I think a lot of it is attitude of we don't want them here, we don't want them in our village.
Well, good luck with your political endeavours anyway. I mean, and I think what we need and what you need to do at a local level is obviously, build a following, as it were, build a movement. And, if we can get enough people, because, I mean, people can stand as independents and make a point, as it were. But the key thing is winning. And that's going to be achieved, I think, if we build a movement. And the political system's not working at the minute. It's broken. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
And we've just got to find a way, I think, of ensuring that the political structures that exist work in the interest. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. Democracy is supposed to be about creating a situation, creating a system that works in the interest of the many, not the few. And that's. I want to go to a few questions. Oh, go on. Sorry, Tess. Go on.
No, I was just going to say the way it's going now with COVID and how many people are going to lose their homes because of COVID. The more people that find themselves in trouble and homeless, I think the unrest can only go one way. It can only go up because everybody's in the same boat. There's no more.
If we get organised, though, organised, I mean, if people get organised and realise that, don't internalise and personalise it as an issue that you have to deal with on your own, as it were, or that it's some personal failing, which there's been a tactic which the media and the establishment has used. They've tried to, they have succeeded in breaking down those kind of collective structures of trade unions and so on, and have kind of personalized and individualized difficulties that people encounter as if it's some kind of failing on their part, really. We've got to somehow think build up those collective structures that previously were around, and we need to build them. And they've never been more important, I think, certainly in my lifetime, that we do that. Just before I move to some questions, though, because we've only got less than 15 minutes to go. I know you've got a new book out, Tess. So do you want to just give that a quick plug?
Thanks. It's called No PD: How to Epically Fail at One Planet Development. It basically just follows the story of how it all worked, and I just wanted to annoy the council, really. Thanks for that, Chris. I forgot about that.
How can people buy it? Where can
it's available on Amazon, or if you come to my blog, I'm on Twitter, Smith, Tess Delaney. If you find me on there, you go to my blog, postcardsfromthehedge.car.blog, and you can buy it direct from me. But it's on Amazon as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Cheers. Great. Thanks, Tess. Let me just go to a few questions, because we're getting quite a few, and we've got about 12 minutes to go. And perhaps if I come back to Ray in the first instance, somebody was just suggesting that we blockade Parliament, I think, and close it down to try and a national strike to shut Parliament down once and I think once and for all is what this viewer is suggesting. What's your thoughts about that, Ray? And also, just before you come in as well, there's one or two other questions. Perhaps take three here and see how far we go with it. There's a chap called Jeremy Upton's asking, is a council tax freeze possible? And then Wayne H is saying, if we put a power in place to requisition property, Wayne's concerned that might end up causing a secondary market of more Airbnb properties. Would be an unintended. He's worried that would be a potential unintended consequence. But what's your thoughts, Ray, about some sort of national protest outside Parliament?
I think that people really need to focus more locally where they live, because the housing crisis is global, not just at Parliament. Parliament does work in the sense that there is small communities where there's maybe 2 or 3 activists, and they like a day out when they can come together with lots of comrades. That's very positive. It's a really good thing. But I think people need to be more radical, and I think they need to do things like occupy the land around their town halls, and if there's green or car park space, create housing projects there, whether it's a soup kitchen to draw attention to it. Occupy the land. It's our land. I think we need to do more of that. The other thing I think that's really important that people get to take into account, Airbnb should be outlawed. You should not be able to. It's a business. If you have a council house, for example, and you're doing Airbnb, you should be charged business rates. A lot of these people don't pay tax. It's wrong. It's got to stop. And I think that the other big issue with direct action is that we have to make sure that when politicians knock on our door, we say to them that I'm only going to vote for you if you do A, B, and C. When you are a member of your union, when you're a member of your local political party, whatever colour that is, you pass motions in support and solidarity with council housing. And that is really, really important. So we actually stop that going on. And then the other thing is, of course, we need to expose what's going on with the right to buy. In 20 years ago, 2024, sorry, the government froze mortgages. So buy-to-let landlords have been paying the same mortgage rates since 2004, okay? Since that time, property capitalization has gone through the roof and rents have gone up by more than 100%. Why, how can that be justifiable that these people are profiteering at such a scale and therefore they're disenfranchising poor people and low-paid workers, and some of them are quite high paid workers who are being forced into poverty through sheer greed? Rent control, as it's just been introduced in Berlin. Berlin's not the capital of socialism, but it's working there. We need to have rent controls. So we need to be really focusing around things that we can win. And I think we can win the argument on rent controls. We can win the argument about defending council housing. And if they're trying to sell it off or they're trying to occupy the land, we occupy the land and we occupy the buildings. And we create communities on that land in those spaces for what that land is used for, in the same way we did in Lewisham. We won that campaign.
Yeah, I mean, so it's local action really is where it's at. I mean, national protests, I suppose, have a place, but in terms of making a difference, we'll probably get more bangs for a buck, I suppose, if I put it that way, if people organise locally and put pressure on their local authority and just do practical things in their localities, as it were. Did you? Well, I mean, I know you're very kind of like unhappy about the whole B&B. Whole Airbnb initiative. I mean, in terms of the potential power being brought in, I mean, there's this question from that Wayne put. He's worried that to requisition property, that might his fear that an unintended consequence could be driving a secondary market and leading to more Airbnb.
What we need to make clear is there's no housing crisis at any one point in Britain. There's 150,000 houses in Britain that are empty. 150,000. If you add in the empty buildings and empty shops, it could be temporary housing. There's no crisis. There's huge numbers of developers who have permission to build developments. The reason they don't is because by restricting supply, it boosts their profit and it boosts their rents. It's the capitalist system. We should be building social housing for social need. Local councils should be doing it, not the private sector, using like they did it back in the day when you had local apprenticeships, using local people who took pride in the work they did. They took pride in the council housing they built. The quality of council housing today is far superior to anything you'll find built in Canary Wharf.
Oh, no, yeah.
And so we need to address it. And the other big thing with this scam with the housing, we have to realize that right to buy is wrong, because how can it be just that people are getting 70% discount on their right to buy? Me and you are subsidizing people to profit from social housing, at the same time putting poor parents with children in temporary housing, which is bad for their mental health. It's terrible for life chances of those children through education and work opportunities. And we're disenfranchising those communities. And it's all about greed, capitalism. The system is bust. And we need to get back to actually saying there is the economic argument of social housing. We need that type of direct action and keep the wording simple. People understand 2 or 3 words. At the moment, we're overwhelmed. At the moment, just one of the things I think is most shocking is that with COVID at the moment, more people around the world have died and will die of poverty than COVID. And yet, because most people dying of COVID are white, and this is my view, we are spending unlimited amount of money on making sure we address that need. Why are we not spending even 10% of that on saving the lives of many people of color who are dying of poverty around the world? And it's all about economics. We have the money. We just need to make sure we have a political will to do with justice, whether it's climate, whether it's NHS, whether it's access to equality, whether it's Black Lives Matter, because all the movements we see at the moment, you talk about people's movements are powerful. Greta was a single girl outside her town hall, a parliament building, who suddenly got one image of her circulated around the world, and she won, all this praise and become a global icon. But that was one young girl with a placard. It shows you the power of one.
No, absolutely.
There's something Paula Peters is one of the most inspiring women you could possibly meet. She's a disabled activist. She showed that disabled people in wheelchairs could get out of their bedrooms and could occupy Parliament. They've done and completely mobilized the disabled movement and political activism for the disabled. Who for years was seen, oh, they're at home, they're useless. She mobilized and gave them a power base. And every week, every Thursday, if you're in Ashton-under-Lyne in Manchester, there's my friend Charlotte Hughes, who runs a food bank and a university protest, universal credit protest, outside her job centre under Ashton-under-Lyne. Every Thursday, and has done since it came in, to campaign against the injustice of universal credit and the impact it has on those most in need.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think your point is well made. Absolutely, in relation to poverty, and of course, from what I've read anyway, it seems that COVID is hitting poorer communities more severely than better off communities. And so if we can eradicate poverty, many of the problems associated with that will be minimized as well. We just probably got time for one more question. I just want to bring in Tanya, if I may, if you're still with us, Tanya. And it's a question from somebody who's a housing association tenant, and he's not happy with them, and saying that how do they get away with some of the poor standards that are play, as it were, in with some of these. I mean, some housing associations are okay. I wouldn't want to come necessarily down them all, but I think his particular one is concerned about boilers expelling fumes into properties, roofs leaking, mold growth, etc. Not much action following complaints to the ombudsman and so on. I mean, they're not really up to the mark, are they? Many housing associations. What can we do about that? What's your experience of them as well?
Well, that's very familiar. And I think that although housing associations are supposed to be not-for-profit, they actually, they've had a series of mergers over the recent years to increase their size, and with the increase in size tends to be the increase in remoteness from the people who they're supposed to serve. They are very concerned with increasing the salaries of the top managers in the housing associations. Also, they're concerned with increasing their overall surplus. And there's many housing associations which hardly build social rented housing now. And they are effectively developers. And so it's really no surprise that they pay very little attention to the things that cost them money. Like
should we abolish them, do you think?
Sorry?
Should we abolish them? Should we, if in an ideal world, should we be campaigning to get rid of housing associations, just have public housing delivered by local authorities and maybe housing co-ops, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think that we should live in a world where people's need comes before profit, and unfortunately, housing associations are acting like profiteering developers. And therefore, I don't see the need for them, actually. I think that public housing, council housing, see the difference. There's another difference between council housing and housing association, and that is that there's a kind of statutory obligation to consult the tenants. People can organise in a similar way to the way they organise in a trade union. As a tenants association, they can put pressure on their landlords, and ultimately they have an ability to vote out their landlords at the next election, whereas you cannot do that with a housing association. And they might have tenants on their board, but there's really no accountability or effective control by tenants. I mean, that's even less. I don't want to overblow how brilliant councils are, but I'd rather be a council tenant than a housing association tenant. Yeah. Can I just make one last point about how change comes about?
Give you that.
So I mean, there's a question: do we have a general strike? Do we, go to Parliament? Do we act locally? I mean, I think we, the actions that we've won, for example, we prevented the stock transfer of 56,000 council homes in Southwark through local organising, hand in hand with the tenant associations, and a lot of the little victories are going to be through local action. But ultimately, who has the power in our society? I mean, you've got the capitalists; they own and control the means of production, and you've got the workers, who are absolutely necessary if any profits are going to be made. And I think that, really, if you're talking about transformation of society to avoid catastrophic climate change, transformation to avoid, the fact that profit is the main motivator in the provision of housing, transformation to ensure that there isn't massive inequalities in health, in housing, in all areas of work. How does that come about? I think we have to rely on the power of the working class to deliver that, and I think that what we need to see is unity across all workers, bringing movements together. The Black Lives Matter movement is a huge inspiration. And when you're talking about COVID-19, it's a massive threat to, people's lives. But so is climate change, so is capitalism, so is poverty. All of these things have one root, and that's the way we organise society. That's what needs to change, and it's workers that have the power to change that. If you're looking for a political project that is going to harness that power, then you have to look at a socialist project that actually bases itself on the working class.
Well, great. The rallying cry at the end there. Thank you very much indeed, Tanya. And certainly one of the things that we're hoping to do with this movement is to do much of what you've just outlined there, really, and to encourage people and to put people in touch with each other, different struggles in different parts of the country, and build that collective solidarity. Because you're absolutely right. There is enormous power. I mean, there's the old Shelley poem. We are many, they are few, and if we can just unlock that potential. And there's so many fantastic projects happening and campaigns, and successful local campaigns. And what's great about that, I think, is success, as it were, breeds success, doesn't it? If it encourages that positivity. If you get a local victory, that encourages people to do more. But I think what we want to try and do is share those local victories, not just in that locality, but much further afield, to hopefully then inspire others to take similar action in their own local communities, and then ultimately, hopefully, encourage new working class leaders to come through and pick up the cudgels and stand for office and make our sort of democratic system actually work for the many, not the few. And frankly, at the moment, it's working in the interests of the corporate elites, not the vast bulk of the ordinary working class in this country. Anyway, look, it's been a great broadcast, in my opinion, first one back after the summer break. Thank you to Tanya, Tess, and Ray, who were fantastic guests. Really enjoyed it. We could have gone on a lot longer. Apologies, as I always have to people who put questions in and we haven't had time to put your points to the contributors. But we will be, if you're not already signed up as a supporter of the resistance movement, please do so. We will do issue a regular newsletter, and we have the Word newspaper as well, where we put different ideas and campaigns and report on things which are happening up and down the country to people. And we've heard from Ray this evening, who's going to put some of his thoughts down, and maybe Tanya and Tess will do likewise, because the key thing is spreading the message. And this is one small way of doing it, through Resistance TV and through our newsletter and the Word newspaper, because the mainstream, the corporate media, I'm afraid, doesn't actually cut it. I mean, they represent the interests of the ruling establishment in this country, and we've got to find alternative ways of getting our message out and encouraging people to stand together and say, we've had enough of this. This is not good enough, and we want something better for the country, to ensure that everybody can live a decent, fulfilled lifestyle. Nobody in this country, and the fifth biggest economy in the world, should be living in poverty, and certainly nobody should be struggling for a roof over their head. I mean, housing is a basic human right, and we need to insist that those people who seek to represent us actually do represent us, and put in place policies which actually deal with these major challenges which are confronting the country right now. So thanks. We've gone over time. Sorry for that. It's my clock's up there if you're wondering where I'm looking. We've gone 5 minutes over. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in, and look out for next week's broadcast. At the same time, same place, 7 o'clock, with Resistance TV. Thanks and good night.